Oh, sailor, have you found your perfect sea?
Welcome to this series of talks that I'm giving. The last one I talked about reason, and to just sum up quickly, I pointed out that in the philosophical tradition, this idea came up, it's an idea, that there was something called the reason. And I pointed out in the last talk that talking about the reason and then trying to discover what it could do would be like talking about the leg before one had done all the things that legs can do. And it's the kind of mystification, I use that word very deliberately, I'm very aware of the pedigree that has, especially to do with Karl Marx and how he used the term, and that's going to be very relevant to this talk today when we talk about ideology. But that it is a certain kind of mystification that comes about when we let ideas run away too much with us and we forget something. So this is a really important thing. We forget that in our language we've registered an experience through coining names for our experiences, and then those names become circulated, and then just in our day-to-day practice and orientation these names start to take on more and more power. Now, you note, I said we register an experience, but I'm not saying we do it in the same way that someone conducting an experiment would do. And yet in some ways it is kind of like an experiment, only in this respect. That is, if it resonates with an experience, people tend to use the same name. They're happy with the word, they're happy with the name. Whereas when we think of scientific experiment, we're thinking of, have we got a formulation that accurately describes the process of cause and effects? And if we have, then we stick with that terminology, and then that becomes part and parcel of the terminology of the development of a particular science. Obviously, I'm really oversimplifying here, but it's not really like everyday use of names and the way in which that circulates on the one hand, and yet insofar as there is a sense of uncertainty whether or not something will take on. And that's the same in language. When we formulate or express something and the experience is quite new, or we've seen something about an experience that might be quite old, but we've seen it in a novel way and we give it a name, and it's a question of, will that name resonate? Will it touch something in people's experience or not? And my point is, ideas easily become sorted out from the rest of what's happening in the circulation of names and words, because ideas tend to become the province of what philosophers do. And so that takes us back to an earlier lecture that I had. And I said, when we start to talk about the reason and our use of reasoning, we start to go along the way that comes from John Locke, when he spoke of philosophy proceeding along the way of ideas. So John Locke is a modern philosopher. When I say modern, I mean writing in the 17th, early 18th century. So he uses this term, the way of ideas, and what he has really done, this is repeating a bit from that earlier lecture, what he has really done is recognize that modern philosophical thinking divides itself from, or hives itself off from what other people were doing prior to modernity by virtue of the metaphysics that it has. That is, it has a set of general principles which it, for whatever reason, it believes are the fundamental, inviolable, unassailable principles from which you can go out and identify the rest of experience and those things that count in the making up of reality. You notice in the case of Locke, experience was the benchmark, but you have other contemporaries of Locke who said, no, it's not just experience. Mathematics, number, for example, is not really something you can adequately explain by reference to experience. Which brings us right back to Plato, as you may remember, was the first person to coin this term idea. Okay. Now, what Locke has done, and what other philosophers have done, is basically set up the idea of reason as a tribunal. And that's something that we find in the writings of Immanuel Kant. He used that very formulation, that reason is a tribunal. So our experiences then, to see which ones are genuine experience as opposed to merely imagined ones, so that becomes the great dividing line as well. So someone like Locke, and in fact one of the things that unites all these modern philosophers, that is, philosophers who are pioneers of the modern condition, which is the modern way of thinking about things, which includes lots and lots of old stuff, and in fact lots of what we moderns do is what everybody has always done, but there's another aspect to it. And one of the reasons that I'm doing this series of lectures is the kind of quandaries and dilemmas and problems and messes that we moderns are making of the world that we live in our attempt to rebuild the world anew, because that's exactly what modernity is an attempt to refabricate the world in so many ways that over time I hope you can understand this, not because it's difficult, but that you can see it with your own eyes, why the modern condition is a rather strange condition, maybe estranged, which may be, and I think this is the case, one reason why people are so romantic about pre-modern traditions, and they look to the pre-modern to help us with our problems. Unfortunately, I think that's not going to work either. We have to deal with the problems that we have generated with the materials that we have at our disposal, and certain things we cannot let go of, even if we wanted to. Letting go of them will create more problems than holding on to them. Part of the dilemma and the paradox of where we're at. So, we find this way of thinking about reality in which these ideas are all important, and what we find is philosophers don't agree about which particular ideas, and they don't agree about what is even the nature of reason. That's part of the problem. Okay. Given this situation, one is not going to be surprised that when there's an attempt to come up with a science of ideas itself, that we're going to create more problems. And that's exactly what occurs philosophically. So although John Locke uses the term the way of ideas, and although two critics I'll briefly mention, one is the more famous David Hume, who prefers the term impression rather than ideas, and the other is Thomas Reid. Reid thinks that Hume is still going along the way of ideas, and he has all sorts of reasons for this, and he says we need to get back to common sense. Now, I'm a great fan of Thomas Reid, and I think Reid is right to be suspicious of the way of ideas, and the way in which you provide an alternative to the way of ideas is paying far more attention to everyday language. Now, later in this lecture talk, I'll also say that that's not without its own problems, and there was a whole movement of philosophy following Wittgenstein coming out of the English analytic tradition especially, in which language was really important. And it created its own set of messes which I think were unfortunate, even though I like Wittgenstein very much, or much of Wittgenstein. Okay, so what Reid had realised, and what even Hume had realised, is this talk about ideas was, it's not problem-free. Nevertheless, that philosophers would tend to want to focus upon those names, let's use the word names, that is, those ideas which had in some way or other been confirmed and verified philosophically, not through everyday experience, but philosophically, that there'd been a kind of large enough consensus amongst philosophers, and philosophers rarely agree on anything, nevertheless to accept that certain things, for example, the imagination is something that you cannot trust unless you subject it to more rigorous scrutiny. By the way, this would all be challenged by a group of thinkers called the Romantics. And one of the greatest English romantics, William Blake, who I'm rereading, and I love William Blake, is extremely smart and critical to this way of thinking. But given that there is at least some consensus that although we can't quite agree about what the ideas are, or we nevertheless agree that there has to be a more rigorous way of deploying our reason to make sense of the world so that we can have a better understanding of life, and so the quality of ideas has improved. Now, a guy called Destutt de Tracy, who was a political economist, coined the word ideology. And what he was interested in, as I mentioned before, was coming up with a science for the study of ideas and how they operate within human action. And he was really interested in the fundamental feelings and drives, needs, which create our ideas. And the way he was talking, though, you could see that the ideas would somehow form a pattern that was a reflection of what we really are. And he was going to identify that. Now, there was a school, Napoleon was even quite critical of these ideologists, but their emphasis upon political economy, and they fitted more within what we, in retrospect, call the liberal tradition. So the word was in play. There were a group that called themselves the ideologists, and they even had an influence on people like Auguste Comte, for example. But that use of the term in terms of where I'm going with this lecture really sort of just didn't take off that much. Where the term ideology really hit its stride as a major word, as a major idea, was in the writings of Karl Marx, and he and Friedrich Engels wrote a book called The German Ideology. Now, when Marx wrote, this is quite different to the subsequent history of other Marxists, but when Karl Marx wrote, he was using the term in a very negative way. And he was basically saying, ideology is what these philosophers and people doing, he calls civil histories, what they write when they are focusing upon what the ideas people have in their head have, but they're not looking at the economic conditions which give rise to their ideas. So there's a split in Marx between what we're doing with our labour, what we're doing in the productive process, and what's really happening, which he believes he can see, and these ideas that we express about the nature of society. So, for example, for Marx, which might surprise many people who don't know Marx that well, he had no time for equality, even though you might say, well, isn't the whole point of communism to have a greater, more equal society? Well, here's the paradox. In some ways, that's exactly what Marx wanted, though he did formulate it from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, which to me, you only have to think for 10 seconds about that to realise what a bad idea that is. But that's another, simply because unless you can control and match up our abilities and needs and our willingness to work and taper our needs to fit that ability, you've just got chaos. You've got things running in all directions, because basically our abilities are slight, our needs can be extravagant. Okay, and of course if you've got a way of controlling that, then it's not going to be a problem, because and if you want to bully people into accepting that this is what their needs really are, well, you can do that. It's not very pretty, but you can do it. Okay, so what Marx was doing there was saying our ideas are really a reflection of our world. So the reason the concept of equality becomes so important is because amongst the bourgeoisie, they want to create circumstances in which there's an equivalence between labour and what they pay for it, even though there's a trick involved in that. And that then dupes people into thinking that they can be all equal without looking at the system of production which generates the original inequalities. I don't believe Marx is right on any of this, by the way, so I'll be very clear, but this is his reason. So the term equality just fits into a whole other set of notions such as social justice. Again, another term that the left has taken on, which Marx didn't really like at all, because justice just means bourgeois justice. Equality just means bourgeois equality, as far as he's concerned. So, what Marx has done is set up this twofold thing. On the one hand, you've got the reality, and that's really, he is a political economist who's not a bourgeois political economist. He is a communist political economist, can see the truth of what those relationships are. He can see they're basically exploitative and oppressive. They're ones in which the labouring class creates all value in the society but does not receive the proper amount of sustenance and reward, if you like, or payment for that value. And this is a con job. And the ideology serves as a way of mystifying this, because it basically gives people another language to talk about reality, and they believe they're creating a society based upon these ideas when they're not dealing with the real fundamentals which Karl Marx, can see. Now, we've gone from Destitute to Tracy, who, by the way, Marx had no time for, to Marx's saying that there's the ideas and then there's the real stuff. And the real stuff is what he as a political economist does, because he's exposed the mystification involved in the economic process, which is generating the bad ideas, so people are caught up in all this. By around the 20th century, and even as Marxism starts to develop, you've got this issue, is you've got people are lining up politically in terms of programs which are then described as ideological. So you can see the word is going under another metamorphosis, so that you have socialism, you have liberalism, you have communism, you have social democratism, or social democracy, that variant of socialism. You have, and conservatism, that were the main ones, and you'll have fascism, and you'll have Nazism. And you can see in this that if you say, I am a communist, you're differentiating yourself from someone who says, I am a fascist, or you say, I am a liberal, I am a conservative. And what you can see is that these programs consist of chains of ideas, and you have a set of commitments which define you by your political belief. So ideology has gone from what Marx had said was basically a mystification to a choice. Now, if you're a communist, you will think that the other choices involve mystification. But increasingly it becomes so that you realise that you are ideologically committed. You're committed to the set of ideas that you have as a communist or a socialist. You see that? So the word has undergone a change, and what you've really got happening is a series of commitments or sets of people with political views, with commitments to certain ways, thinking about the world a certain way. This should, it shouldn't be changed much. You're a conservative. It should be radically changed, and the whole market system torn up, and we should, get rid of markets, and we should just have whatever it is that communists think they're going to have. But what they will end up with is a big state. Or the liberals, who, again, in their way, they're equally fantastical. We will just have the market and not the state. Well, the problem with that is you need laws and everything, and politicians to make sure that the markets run properly and that people don't cheat on don't violate tort law or property law or contract law or whatever. So, you've got these various positions. Now, once you've got this, there's other things that are happening. You could almost say it's like the subconscious of all of this. And so I'm using this word very loosely, but if you're thinking along these lines, you have, in a way, already committed yourself, aligned yourself with another set of beliefs that may not be clear to you. Purpose of this lecture, and where I'm going with it, is to uncover what it is people weren't thinking about, consciously at least, when they were thinking this way about all the different choices they had. And then as it came more into view exactly what they were really thinking, we see, well, actually, there's a whole set of problems there, philosophical problems, that lay in wait. And you'd be less inclined to go with an entire program if you looked more carefully at what it was you were buying into. But then people buy into this other lot of things and they think, oh, there's no problem here, when in fact there's a whole stack of problems. So what are these other things that people are buying into? First, and this is one that is a big hit. People really think this is great, and it's a terrible idea. And the formulation, which became increasingly common around the 1960s and 70s, was that society is a social construction. Everything is socially constructed. Now, if you think about that for a second, what that suggests is that if it's a social construction, then the ideas we have, if we get the right ones and we fix the world the right way to fit with our ideas, then we can construct the kind of society we want. So you can see the way of ideas going back to John Locke, and even what Destutt to Tracy is doing. And in his own way, Marx is doing it. It's just he's got this two-tier model of ideas happening, one of which he doesn't want to call ideas, but which are, in fact, they're ideas about political economy, and another set of ideas about law, judicial processes, rights, all this other stuff that we talk about, which is really a mirror reflection of what is happening at the lower level. But we're still talking about ideas, as I said, and then now we're talking about ideologies, which have become the commonplace way of talking about ideologies by the, as the 20th century advances, more and more people just go, I'm a communist, I'm a this, I'm a that, I've got this ideology, you've got that ideology, we don't see eye to eye, I'm going to annihilate you, or I'll accept what you say, or whatever. And my ideology, and this is where Marxists always had this position, but I know why you have your ideology, because you're bourgeois and I'm not. Of course, the problem with that, and this is taking me to the nub of the issue I want to raise today, and in some ways I think this is the point that's invariably left out of talks about ideology, that really what is happening there is that someone or a group of people think that they have the answers to the way reality is, and they want people to join their team. It's a recruitment agency. And I call this clientelism. They're wanting clients. So they've got the right ideology, they've got the right idea, and they're looking for the rest of us poor sap who don't really know what we're doing, or we've got a mistaken ideology, to come and join their team. And they will instruct us, and we will be their clients, because they will know how we can solve all our problems. So that's really what I think ideological thinking leads to. It leads to a kind of dependency of thought upon another group of people who claim that they have understood the system within which we live. No, we live within a system. That's the first thing that's being assumed. Now, there's good and bad ideas about believing we're in a system. I just want to take us now philosophically to the philosopher Hegel, because Hegel was the greatest, in my opinion, philosopher who thought through, and there's huge problems in his philosophy, by the way, but there's lots of wisdom and lots of great insight. And Marx and Engels were part of a group that took some stuff of Hegel on board and reacted against Hegel. They were called the young Hegelians. And as Marx and Engels got older, they started to speak more and more fondly of the old fellow, as they called Hegel. But they did take on a few things very strongly on board from Hegel, and in my opinion they got it very badly wrong. Now, Hegel had argued that all philosophy is reason expanding itself, and not only all philosophy, but the world is the expansion of reason itself, and the world is a story of the development of the absolute, and the spirit of the absolute being a spirit of absolute freedom, which is the spirit of reason itself, which is the spirit of the infinite in its dialectical development. Dialectic being the movement of the system is generated by oppositions which are unified, and the dynamic of that unified unfolding of its contradictions and expansion. I either accept that or just put it on hold, but the reason I mention that is because he was interested in knowledge. And so, as you can see from that account, now this is, if you think about certain things, that could be quite a powerful way to look at reality. But the problem is, to be correct, you'd have to know everything. And that's, in effect, what Hegel has to know is the absolute, the all, the entirety of things. He's got to know the system. And you can't know the system by simply recognizing one feature which you say is the most important thing, because you've got to know the other bits of it to know that it is the most important thing. And this is the weak spot of Hegel. Okay. But here's the point I want to make. For Hegel, this system only makes sense if it's an idea. And it's why its philosophy is a kind of idealism. And what Marx and the neo-Hegelians did, they hated that idea of being beholden to the idea of the absolute. And Marx said, no, it's, if we understand the material conditions, then we need to turn Hegel up on his feet. He's standing on his head. He's seeing the world as a reflection of the head, where it's really the material conditions which are the truth in its dialectical development. Now, the problem with this, and it's really like an undergraduate bad essay reading Marx against Hegel. Genius Hegel. Marx quite clever, but, just as silly. Because the issue is, what knowledge do you have about political economy? And give me your knowledge without it being knowledge, and of course you can't. What you've got is a set of ideas, a study, a discipline, a way of integrating the information, which is all Hegel means by ideas. And what Hegel wants to do is demonstrate the interconnectedness of all the ideational totalities, all the ideas, the disciplines, if you will, that make up this absolute. And then he's got to have it in development. But as I said, he's got to know everything. And you just can't do it. So he's picked up that in some way there's a connection between the sciences, and he does this magnificent work, very difficult, tortured but brilliant, called The Logic, in which he wants to identify the processes of short thought shaping, which is also the process of freedom making. And as great a job as he does, and he does really create lots of stuff to think with, the fact remains that as you keep reading Hegel, to take two examples, his History of Nature and his Lectures on the Philosophy of History, you're like, well, he's leaving so much out, and it starts to get completely arbitrary. Whereas his friend Schelling, who also talked about the absolute, who's a brilliant thinker as well, said, let's accept it's absolute and it's all poetry. Which, it's all our genius. Well, that's good too. But, and you are a genius, but the rest of us, are we going to follow you because you're a genius, or are we going to follow you, Hegel, because you're a know-all? So you can see why people working with ideology, like Marx, who, as I said, against ideology, but really laying down a new ideology, are coming up with a program which wants to not fall into the trap of Hegel, but it does so in spite of itself. And how does it fall into the Hegel trap? and it's this. It claims to understand the system as system. In the case of Marx, the explanation is in terms of the nature of commodity production. I won't go into the details of it, but he believes, having identified the germ cell of the commodity, he is then able to read off society as a whole, how it conforms to that. So you've got a law, and then you've seen the rest of reality according to the law. Now, how would you possibly confirm whether or not the law you've got is right? Well, the way you would have to do that is you'd have to observe it and then see what other laws you have and see if they play themselves out over time. No, of course, that's not. Marx is not interested in setting up a disinterested, scientifically observable set of solutions to the problem, because he believes he knows the answer, and he knew it at the ripe old age of 25 or 26. I said this in an earlier lecture. And it's just a question of changing reality to do it. He doesn't have time to watch it. So if he's wrong, well, you'll find that out generations down the track. And what you've also got is a whole group of people wanting to participate in how to make reality, try to make the world a certain way by, for example, overcoming this law of commodity production by getting rid of capital. That's a very long story, but here I just want to focus on. But you can see the problem. Someone is claiming to know the system. There are people who want to change the world. If they believe this, then they join this ideology. They're still members of they've created their own ideology. But the fact is, the quality of their ideas has to be assessed, not just backwards, but forwards. How would you know, for example, whether socialism would work or not, unless you did it? Well, what you might do is ask the question which Marx never asked. Why, when you had complicated, that is, division of labour at a complex level, why was there always some kind of property relations involved? Why was that the case? And Marx actually does kind of look with this, but in a very inadequate way, in his early writings on political economy. And he immediately comes to the idea that, well, what we need to do is get rid of the division of labour. Well, good job making electric guitars, jumbo jets and everything else that we, scotch and all these other things that we like without some division of labour. Okay. So what has happened is that Marx has thought that he has solved a problem because he's identified the law. He does this a little later, as I said, the germ cell of the commodity. He's identified the law of the system. But the fact is that there is no system that's static because we're in it. We're not above it. And this is the problem that all ideologists have, is they're living within a process which we are constantly making, which, to be sure, it has certain features which we can identify that there are causal relationships. I'm not denying that, don't get that wrong. But what we can't do is overlook the whole thing. Remember what I said about reason being like an orb? That's why I've spoken about ideology after reason, because this is pure rationalism. You've dispensed with experience, even though you've used some experiences, but at some point you've gone along with and said, I know what we can do to make reality the way we want it to be. In today's term, I know society is a social construction. I can make us construct it better. If you just follow us, if you let us lead you, notice all this talk of leadership, fellowship. If you will be our clients, we will service you, but we will make the world a great place to live in. Now, one of the good things about conservatives, and let me be very clear here, I don't want to say I'm a conservative for the simple reason is some things just fall apart. You can't conserve everything. Life is mutation and transformation, but it is also a degree of stability. getting the question right of what in the past has to be retained if certain aspects of our existence pertain a certain way, which we can observe that, and what other things just are breaking because our commitments to it, our faith in it, our belief in it, our ability to even understand it, our ability to draw nourishment from it has gone, and our desire then to leap into the future. This is why ideologies take off. They take off because things have broken down, and in the modern condition is one, and here Marx was very good, and the other person very good on modernity is Baudelaire. Talks about it being the eternal within the ephemeral, but it's the ephemerality of this, so there's this great motion, and what we do is we transform relationships so that, the obvious one that and I've probably talked about it before, is the way in which the family changes, because we can't quite rid ourselves of the fact that people need each other, but the way in which they need each other, where relationships now are so individualistic in the modern Western world especially, that new alliances and configurations of relationships involving those aspects of ourselves we really want to hang on to, or really want to give a great deal of importance to, that they take an importance which makes us redefine, for good and for bad, our social relationships and our modalities of social bonding, the way in which we formulate groups. So it's understandable then why, especially after the Industrial Revolution, there you've got socialism, there you've got communism, there you've got liberalism, even though the pedigree of liberalism is older, but really as an ideology, it's also 19th century. It's really, ideology is the big thing of the 19th century, as the more traditional formations of social authority and political authority start to crack. And that's got a lot to do with a class of people, the professional classes, especially those who traffic in ideas, laws. The number of lawyers, for example, involved in both the American and the French Revolution, it's really very, very important, because they are people who are dealing with rules, regulations, formulation of those rules and regulations, and they are the people which ultimately are going to be most frequently appearing within a political forum. They're going to be intrinsic to the modern process, especially the liberal democratic process. If you've got communism or fascism or something else like that, you may be able to get around that, because then your word just is law. You don't need to do any fine tuning around it. You just say, that's it, we're doing it. But even in the earliest instance of people that are attracted to these ideologies, is find very similar types from very similar professions. What will tend to vary is the region in which it takes place. That's why fascism is something that comes out of Italy, comes out of Germany. Why? And you've got to look at that generation, their experience of the war, why they wanted that. Whereas also the ideas that have been in circulation with the elite generation, that is those people going to university, getting a higher position, the higher class of professionals, what they were like in Russia, for example, was very different to what they were like in the UK or France. You'll start to see the ideology you get, and this is where Marx is kind of right. It's true that it's just in a sense, he curtailed, he shrunk too much what he calls the material conditions. You do need to understand that. You do need to understand all those historical forces, including economic forces, including social forces, which tend to condense within a region. And that will tend to give you common ways of talking and seeing things. So now this was Nietzsche's idea of the will to power of groups, and a certain perspective comes out of the way that you are simply rooted in your reality, the way that you engage in your reality. So this was quite, if ideology had remained a way of trying to explain this, in fact I don't even think you would need the world to explain this phenomenon, the word to explain this phenomenon, it is a genuine phenomenon, then it would be helpful. What becomes unhelpful is the idea that people from anywhere can take on any sets of ideas and thereby reshape the world to fit the sets of ideas. No, that really is the wrong way, and that's what Marx was trying to get right, and not being fair to Hegel, you know, when he said things are on their head, you need to tip them over. Yeah, sure, you do need to understand these other processes, but understanding the processes, you can't escape drawing upon ideas, which was Hegel's point. But the question is, how do you evaluate the ideas? And this is why you need philosophy. That's why philosophy is such a valuable thing. But it's not valuable. It's not so valuable it can create a picture of the world which the rest of us should line up and live by. This is precisely why I'm giving this set of lectures, so that philosophy can learn to be humble again, and philosophers stop being know-alls, as well as all these college-educated kids who think they're fixing up a world which is leading us into very hell. And even when the good, the bad, and the ugly all get, you know, turned into a washing machine load, you know, pile of crap. Okay. So let me sum this up. I realise I've been moving around to a lot of different positions, and you know, might think this is a rant. Okay, but reason is not a substance, it's a thing we do. With our reasoning, we do reason with ideas. We tend to select certain names and we tend to concentrate on them. And the danger is, and it was a danger that Nietzsche saw, that Marx saw, but they immediately fell back into the danger. In fact, seeing it doesn't mean you do it right. You know, it doesn't mean you avoid the danger. You think it might do that, but it doesn't mean that at all. Rightly see that there is a danger within philosophy that it mystifies our reality and our relationships. Now, if you set up something like the world should be there for the Superman, or the world should be there communist, you've fallen into an ideology. You've fallen into taking a set of ideas and trying to make us comply with those ideas because it's programmatic. So an ideology is always going to be about a program. It might be, you know, lose the details of that program. For example, Marx didn't want to talk about the details of communism. That was beneath him, and he thought, oh, that'll take care of itself. Well, so he had an ideology, but the program, he still had a program of a very, very loose sort. You can see the 10 points, very loose, that he comes up with in the Communist Manifesto. But the idea of eliminate private property, that's a big programmatic idea. It's a terrible idea, because you've got to think about what are the consequences of that. You can't just say that's a great idea. No, an idea always has to come back to, first lecture, our character. But our character also has to come back to our personal circumstances. Our personal circumstances come back to our historical, social, dramatic conditions, our own existentially dramatic conditions. This all complicates it. And you know what? You know who hates this complication is the very people that should love it. The professional classes trafficking in ideas hate this kind of idea. Because if you take this seriously, you're not going to have an ideology. And there's all sorts of people running around writing books saying, oh, what an idiot, they think they don't have an ideology. Man, I can tell you your ideology. And usually what they're doing is saying, you know, I'm a socialist and you don't agree with me, therefore you're bourgeois. Or I'm a feminist, you don't agree with me, therefore you're patriarchal. Well, what can you say to that? You know, these people believe that they know everything. Oh, no, we don't. No, we don't. Yes, you do. If you didn't think you knew everything, you would work on a much smaller scale of trying to fix this problem and that problem. So, wanting to fix problems, that's our lot. And all the great social advancements, and I want to be very careful here, because every advancement is another set of problems. There's no such thing as unmitigated good in what we do. We're just not that kind of creature. This is why, way back whenever, people dreamt of other worlds. And there's a lot of wisdom in that, because you realise the problems of this world are insoluble within this world. They're just not soluble. Now, this is not an excuse for people not acting, though I think the world would be a lot better if the acts really involved a bit of sacrifice, a bit of compassion, and doing this for that, for this for that, instead of some grand, great scheme, great big words where you create this big machine, and you start seeing people behave disgustingly towards each other as they feed each other into the machine, and ultimately they just recruit people into their own objectives. So it becomes a power. Now, societies do require power. They do require elites, and I will give a talk upon elites. But I want to talk first about voluntarism and determinism. Because certainly voluntarism is a big part of what I've been talking about today. Voluntarism is basically the idea that the human will can make of the world what it will. Determinism, and Marx, interestingly, could be seen as both a voluntarist and a determinist. And they didn't sit easily within him. But a determinist basically believes there are laws, and I've identified what the laws are of history, and they're inescapable. Well, these are two very ist ways of thinking, voluntarist, determinist. In their way, they're metaphysical as well as ideological, and they're both terrible ways to think. But they're very commonplace ways of thinking. So in the next talk, I want to talk about voluntarism and determinism, because I think they're closely related, and very often in philosophy. Another one that you'll see is absolutism and relativism. I will give a talk on that as well another time. You see these pairs come up, which both of them are one-sided, and the problem is that neither term is very good, because they're trying to capture a problem, but the formulation of the problem itself, as well as the solution to the problem, is as big a problem as what it is they're trying to solve. And this is why also I would just say that real philosophers, and this I'm going to say I'm with the philosophers because I would aspire to be, love knowledge, love wisdom, and it's the love that is driving them, and they're quite happy to accept their massive limits to their knowledge, and that they're just trying to make some very small steps. But in these small steps that we're making, one of the things that we have to do, and this is what I said real philosophers, is we have to walk away from the philosophical language that we've inherited, because we realise that as philosophy has developed, it's changed over time, it's mutated, but there's also a pile of rubble and errors, which is how it would necessarily be, because we are creatures that can't see everything. We don't see the system. We see bits and pieces of stuff. We call it a system, and as soon as we call it a system, we've come up with one or two or a handful of connected principles, ideas, and ideology, which we think is going to, if we fix that, we fix everything. And that is a complete fantasy. And that's why, if you are committed to an ideology, I urge you for your own sake, get your brain back. Thank you.